Well, I'm here with Joseph Myers, a good friend for almost 20 years, a colleague, best-selling author of Search to Belong, a film producer, a consultant, the founder of Narratology, a storytelling branding model. But what we're really talking about is the challenge companies are facing when the new normal, when we come back. And I'm going to relay again uh, to Joseph three conversations I've had in 2 days. One is a high tech firm in Silicon Valley, one is a startup firm in the Phoenix area, another is an energy firm in the Southeast. All three of them have similar questions. What's it going to be like when our people come back? Uh, are people going to be comfortable getting into a conference room together? Uh, a new Harris poll said that about 20% of employees are stir crazy, eager to come back. A large percentage are willing but anxious. You've got some that have been outside and found there's new freedom working remotely. But then there's a good number that are going to be absolutely scared. Uh, this is a different kind of issue. It's not just a design issue, but how would you frame this up? What is some of the work you're doing that might be able to help some of these clients think through how do we do this onboarding? What's the pace? What are we going to run into? What do we need to think about?
Yeah, so it's really interesting in that um, I think that it's a both and. One, people are loving staying at home. And you're going to have a certain segment of population who first thing they're going to ask is, can I work part-time at home? Because they've so
Right.
enjoyed this
Yeah.
experience and they've been more productive.
Right.
And we're going to have to figure that out. I mean, it's a new day, right? Then two, especially for employee engagement. Two, when they do come back, there's a few things that are happening, and all of it I think has to do with community and belonging, or at least a portion has to do with how we connect, how we're belonging to one another, and creating those spaces that give us safety and encouragement to belong. I hiked a few years ago the Camino, walked across Spain, and I remember coming into one small town about 2 weeks into it, and a van pulls up because we were going to stay in that town, but it was at a hotel just outside, and it pulls up, opens the door, which was my uncle's last name, who I was hiking with. Yes, that's who we are. Have no idea how they knew that. And they said, we're picking you up. In the van, in the back seat, bench back seat, were two ladies. My uncle got into the front seat, passenger seat, and I sat beside these two ladies. We introduced ourselves like you always do on the Camino, and then one of the ladies sitting right next to me, innocently, when she introduced herself, touched my knee. I hadn't been touched by a human being for 2 weeks. The visceral, I almost wept because of that touch.
Huh.
And I think that's what we're going to experience, at least for the first 1 or 2 weeks. When people get back, they're going to want to come back. They're going to want touch, physical and spatial and all that. They're going to want those things. So I think that one of our clear, the best companies, what they're going to do is before they invite people back is have guidelines. And the guidelines tell you how you can touch one another, meaning can we shake hands? Can we, hug? Is all that acceptable in the office? Or are we still at the fist pump stage? But even that touch is significant. So we have to define how people
Wow.
can actually have physical touch.
Wow. Yeah.
And give that clear message. And what that does then is it creates a safe space for people to experience social, public, social, and personal spatial communities and develop those in a whole new way that they didn't before. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Have you thought about, so one of my uh, interests, and I'm enlisting people in this, is to shift the language away from social distancing to physical distancing, uh, because we need to be socially connected, but we also need to be physically separate. But what does social connection look like in kind of these these different contexts?
Yeah. So, um, great question. And I've been doing the same because it's not the same thing. Social distancing, physical distancing aren't the same thing. The main reason why is because humans think about connection and design connection and make believe connection in our mind, not in physical space.
Hmm.
Now, physical space can inform, it can help, it can promote, it can separate us. There's all kinds of things that can happen. But it's the mind that actually makes it clear whether we're connecting in an actual community or not. For instance, you and I could be walking down a hall in an office space, press a button, a door opens, we're having a fruitful conversation. We walk onto a crowded elevator, doors close, we stop talking
Right.
until we walk off of it, and all of a sudden we're back into the conversation. Why? Because that space is a public space. The hallway wasn't. We were kind of probably in social or personal kind of connection and making that connection in our conversation. But as soon as we got in this tight box, which you would think would be an intimate connection, it became public. It's because in our minds, that's the way we think of that space.
Yeah, you're reminding me of the work that was done. I don't know the author, but it was pattern thinking, looking at defining these different zones. How do you think these zones of, intimate, social, public, how do you think these zones are going to be redefined, if at all? Are they going to be redefined?
No, I think they already have been redefined, and that's Christopher Alexander, by the
Yeah,
way,
yeah, yeah, right.
one of my favorite authors of all time. Um, Here's the thing: is that when I did the study for Search and did worldwide studies, not just U.S. based or Western based, one of the interesting things we saw was different cultures practice different activities in each of the four spatial communities: public, social, personal, and intimate. So in China, for instance, personal space connection was much different activity-wise than it was in the Western world. Less touch, less engagement, and yet they felt this personal connection.
Got it.
So
Yep.
it's not just the activities, and so we are changing our activities. It's how do we now reform or reframe our brains to think about our new activities in different ways. So for instance, we're doing this thing right now. You have framed yourself in a specific way on screen. I frame myself in a specific way that makes this feel more like a personal, social, personal kind of connection. Now, if all of a sudden I'm back here and I'm trying to talk to you in this kind of framework, I have just now made this a different connection between the two of us.
Interesting. Yeah.
So it's not just physical space, it's how we've interpreted, and now we're going to reinterpret those spatial connections, how a fist pump or maybe a namaste is going to replace the handshake.
Interesting. So people pacing this, people coming back, I get the guidelines, but then you've got the eager, the anxious, the fearful coming in. How, and of course, companies are sometimes communities, but sometimes not.
Mhm.
So they're all over the spectrum in terms of connection, and you've got probably sub communities in there. But the bottom line is, you've got a date where somebody says everybody can come back. How would you advise a client saying, okay, here's what you do a month before, here's what you do 2 weeks before, here's what you do the first week when they're back? I mean, this is really a pacing strategy.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I actually just got off the phone this morning with a company who's talking about this and how are we going to roll this out. So one of the suggestions that I have is that you don't bring everybody back at once.
Okay.
I think that you do a survey, and just say, hey, we're just trying to get everybody's comfortability, as it looks like we're going to probably open in the next 4 to 6 weeks or 2 to 5 days, whatever that is. We would just like to know, how are you feeling about that? What are your anxieties? What are your concerns? What are you looking forward to? That kind of thing. It'd be nice to have that information. And then I would do it by groupings. So those who are anxious to come back, let's get them back first, and do maybe even an online connection between those who are still at home and those who have come back, and make it feel like, oh, wow, I'd love to be back into that party. I'd love to be back in that setting. Oh, look, it is safe. So we're going to show examples, I think, of how bringing people back we're doing things by setting parameters that are safe, and
Right.
we're actually practicing those, and people are enjoying it in the environment that we used to work in.
So if you're a workplace that has kind of the open desking system, people pretty close to each other, very fluid, and some are thinking, well, are we going to go back to the 1980s and 90s where we had 60-inch high cubicles, 8x8 offices, 8x10s? Uh, what's the guidance in trying to figure out how you modulate from, being 4 feet away from somebody and having someone in front of you possibly? I don't. There's not many that dense, but how do you modulate between, because it's early yet? People may get back to a rhythm, but you may have some who are absolutely freaked out being in that disking system. How do you navigate, and how would you advise a client to look at how do we work through that and give people some options and choice?
Yeah, so again, this client talked about this morning. One of the things that we looked at their facility, and one of the things that we were able to do is say, okay, for people who are anxious, let's move their desk or their workspace to maybe one of our boardrooms, and put 2 people in that boardroom instead of 10, or 3 people, depending on how big it is. Let's start giving those spatial guidances, and those that gets people back into the community safely, and lowers their anxiety. Because here's the thing, as you know, one of the topics that I love to talk about is trust and distrust. And trust and distrust are on 2 separate parts of the brain. We process distrust in the prefrontal cortex. So I think, are we okay? It
Uh,
froze for a second.
Redo
So
that. Yeah, redo. Yeah, I'll edit it.
okay, so we process in the distrust in the amygdala, and trust in the prefrontal cortex. So if we think that people aren't going to come with some distrust, no matter what we do, and the arguments that we lay out, and what we say we're going to do safety-wise, that's all talking to the prefrontal cortex. That's all trying to build trust, which is great. That's what we should do. But also, people are going to come with this fight, flight, or freeze response of distrusting, because they just went through a very enormous crisis, and that's going to be heightened. And they're going to have amygdala hijack from all the news, all the fear, all of that kind of thing. So helping them lower that distrust is different than raising the trust level. Lowering the distrust is giving examples of how we're actually surviving, and giving people the actual space they need, whether that's, hey, you can work at home for the next 3 weeks, or maybe you work 2 or 3 days and in our place, and 2 or 3 days at home. Giving them the flexibility to get back into the rhythm where that distrust level lowers, and that trust, and it becomes a guide dog for the trust to take place.
Wow. So, any final piece of advice? If you're the head of real estate or facilities for a company that's got, 500 people coming back, you've got a skeleton crew now, but all these people are going to come back. Uh, how would you advise them to prepare themselves to lead kind of this next area? Because the leadership is really going to come from the corporate real estate and operations people. They're the people who are the custodians of everybody's experience.
Yeah, and or if you're a small business and you have 20, it's on that founder or CEO to play all those roles, right? And I don't think it's much different between how you bring 20 people back and how you bring 1,000 people back.
Great.
I think you have to determine that this is a new world. It's not like we switched on the COVID-19 season and now we're going to switch it off and it's all going to go back to the way it was. That's not going to happen.
Right.
We are in a new season, new world, which is great, but we have to be flexible in that new season. You cannot, in that flexibility, you cannot treat everyone the same. You can treat, or equally, you can treat people congruently, but it doesn't have to be equally, right?
Got it.
And having that flexibility is going to, for years, give you the authority. So the one thing people are looking for from leadership is empathy and authority. So care and competency, right? And so you have to lead with empathy. Hey, I understand. And so we're going to have this flexible system. But authoritatively, we also know that we are stronger than we ever have been as a company, and we're building strength through you, whether you're at home, whether you're home and here, or you're here, we are getting the job done. And here are the products that we're going to roll out, and here's how we're solving our clients' needs, and this is how you fit in.
Yeah, that's inspirational. I'll work for your company. If somebody wanted to connect with you listening to this, how would they do that?
The best way to connect with me is either on my website, josephrmyers.com, MYERS, or you can always email me at joseph@josephrmyers.com.
Great. Joseph, thank you very much. And I'll look forward to continuing this conversation. I've got a lot of clients. This is top outside of survival, operational survival. This is the next driving question they've got. All right. Take care.
Thanks.